Sometime in the early summer of 1956, an F-100A Super Sabre rotated and landed at a half-finished airfield near Trabzon, Turkey. This might seem like a totally normal occurrence, albeit in a slightly unusual location, and it would have been were it not for the fact that the rear end of this F-100 looked like it had been attacked with a blowtorch. The titanium fuselage was full of scorched holes. Now, the F-100 was a fast and powerful aircraft for its day. Its J57 engine usually made about 15,000 pounds of thrust in afterburner, and the manual said you could run that afterburner for 15 minutes before you'd need to shut it off to avoid melting something you'd likely need later. Besides, you'd likely run out of fuel anyway if you ran the burner for 15 minutes. Anyhow, this particular F-100 was known as a bit of a hot rod. Its engine had been rated at over 16,000 pounds of thrust, and that was a lot in 1956, and it was always going to test the mechanical components of a jet. So maybe 15 minutes was more like 14 minutes for this particular Super Sabre. The jet slowed and began a fast taxi to a hastily erected corrugated iron hangar at the end of the airfield. Sharp-eyed observers of the dishevelled fighter would have spotted the non-standard modifications to its nose and belly before it was gone into the hangar. How this Super Sabre's pilot came to melt through the aft section of his plane's fuselage is quite an interesting story. It involves an illegal intrusion into Soviet airspace and a 3-hour game of cat and mouse with a dozen interceptors from the Soviet Air Defense Forces. It is also a subject so secret at the time that very little has emerged about it to this day. The story begins in late 1953 during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Soviet Union had detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949 and began to rapidly build up bomber forces within range of the newly aligned NATO countries in Western Europe. Keen to avoid war, Eisenhower's doctrine was essentially one of deterrence. Nuclear forces would ensure that the Soviets would never launch a conventional attack. The US therefore really wanted to know what forces were being deployed, where they were, and how the Soviets might defend them. Updating the United States' own nuclear targeting plan was a constant priority. The logical way to gather that information was from the air, but the presence of a large number of MiG-15 and 17 fighters made this a very hazardous enterprise. In response to the need for aerial reconnaissance, the Lockheed Corporation had come to the Air Force earlier that year with a proposal for a radical, high-flying spy plane dreamed up by their genius designer Kelly Johnson. The crash program to develop it was proceeding at pace, but was realistically some years away. Tensions were high, and an interim solution was needed. But where could they find a fast, high-flying aircraft with enough range to be useful and enough speed to evade the Soviets' new MiG-17 interceptor? Fortunately, an answer was right in front of them. In late 1953, North American Aviation was asked to make a 6-aircraft proposal which would offer the reconnaissance ability required until the U-2 arrived in service. They were to modify their new Super Sabre supersonic fighter for the task. Although the requirement initially looked simple, the modifications required turned out to be complicated and extensive. Each aircraft would mount 5 cameras. 3 were in a trimetragon arrangement and 2 in a split vertical mount. The Fairchild K-17 6-inch focal length mapping type camera was selected for the trimetragon installation. These 9x9-inch plate cameras provided overlapping coverage from horizon to horizon. The photographs they produced were small scale from high altitude, but they covered a very large area and could provide some intelligence information. The primary cameras for intelligence gathering were 2 Fairchild K-38 36-inch focal length cameras mounted in a split vertical configuration. The K-38 had a large plate measuring 9 by 18 inches, but when mounted in this configuration the coverage overlapped, giving coverage equivalent to a plate twice the size. From high altitude, the coverage was substantial at an acceptable scale for the photo interpreters. The K-38s would secure 60% line-of-flight overlap for stereoscopic viewing. For example, at 30,000 feet altitude, the side-by-side coverage would be 5.86 miles at a scale of 1 to 10,000. At 45,000 feet altitude, the coverage across the line of flight would be 8.8 miles at a scale of 1 to 15,000. While the resolution of the cameras and film were not anywhere near what they are today, the large scale permitted acceptable intelligence results. As you can imagine, getting all of this kit into the Super Sabre was far from easy because the huge air intake to the single jet engine went through the nose under the cockpit. To obtain space, North American removed the 20mm M39 cannons and all the ammunition bays. It was also necessary to bulge the sides slightly to accommodate the right and left oblique trimetragon cameras. To fit them in, it was also necessary to mount the Fairchild K38 cameras horizontally and let each one shoot through a mirror to achieve the desired viewing angle. To reduce mirror vibration, the mirrors were attached to the camera in a precise manner that made them an integral part of the camera body. Numerous aircraft electronic black boxes were moved to different locations to accommodate the cameras. Adjusting the balance of the aircraft to enable it to fly acceptably took considerable effort. To make this a reconnaissance aircraft, a viewfinder was installed in the cockpit through which the pilot could see the Earth below. This was actually quite a unique installation as well. The viewfinder was constructed in two parts, again because of the large air duct through the centre of the aircraft. The bottom part reflected on a ground mirror at the bottom of the air duct, and the top part picked up this image through a large clear glass plate at the top of the air duct. The viewfinder worked fine as long as the glass at the bottom and top of the duct was clean. It also contained vertical lines that the pilot could move in the cockpit and obtain the degrees of drift. There were other annotations that indicated when to turn the cameras on to cover a target. The viewfinder poked up through the cockpit floor and made getting in somewhat hazardous for the pilot, but this was seen as a necessary evil given its specialized role. The rest of the design necessarily focused on safely getting all of those optics somewhere useful and then getting the resultant film back out again. Like all 1950s vintage fighter aircraft, the F-100 had limited internal fuel capacity. The internal tanks held 1,150 gallons, about 7,500 pounds, and the two external tanks held 275 gallons each, giving a total of 1,700 gallons or 11,000 pounds. These two external tanks were designed for supersonic flight and were carried on nearly every flight. This configuration, however, called for the addition of two more tanks, each holding 200 gallons attached to the inboard pylons. These tanks were not aerodynamic, and the four external tank configuration both diminished performance and made the aircraft quite a handful to control. To achieve the maximum fuel storage, a filler neck in the fuel venting lines was stuffed with another 21 gallons. An additional 12-inch extension was added to each wingtip to meet the altitude requirement. Again, this looks like a simple thing to do, however, to operate safely at high altitude, the pilot needed to wear a pressure suit, and this resulted in changes to the cockpit and oxygen system. The theoretical operating radius with this fuel load and aerodynamic configuration was 635 nautical miles, about 720 miles or 1,150 kilometers in new money. However, that radius was at 36,000 feet and assumed only the use of afterburner for 75 miles, and the use of 82% power for the rest of the mission. That profile would have put the aircraft and pilot at extreme risk from the Soviet defences, so real missions would have to take place above 50,000 feet and either at full military power or in afterburner, significantly reducing range. The F-100 had no air-to-air refueling capability at this time, and lack of range was a bugbear for USAF aircraft commanders that limited its use. This highly modified and exotically equipped aircraft was the Slick Chick, and for the time these 6 aeroplanes were seriously hot chicks, capable of operating well above 50,000 feet and above Mach 1 for extended periods of time. Lack of range meant that the Slick Chicks were mainly limited to surveilling the Soviet satellite states from their bases in West Germany. They first went into action in 1955, and those first missions caused a furore in Washington. It was not the photography that was such a shock, although the resolution was something incredible. The cameras could pick out a white golf ball on a green from 53,000 feet. When the Slick Chicks first crossed the border, wherever it was they went, they encountered 10 times more radars than the US ever thought existed, and they went in at 50,000 feet at Mach 1, and the Soviets still picked them up easily and tracked them easily every bit of the way. That information came back to Washington, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and everybody was very shaken up to know that the Soviet radars were quite that good. It was the first time anyone had ever really used a high-performance aeroplane to punch into the Soviet Union, and in doing so, NATO realized that the Soviet air defense radar system was really very good. So, ironically, nobody cared about the pictures that resulted, because of the air defense network reaction that the penetration had touched off. While we're on the pictures, I thought it might be interesting to see a couple of examples taken by these cameras in Korea. These are night photos illuminated by flash flares. The resolution is pretty incredible for 1951, I think. And the improved lenses on the Slick Chick enabled it to take such photos from even higher altitudes. Perhaps surprisingly, the 3 Slick Chicks assigned to Bitburg in West Germany only made 6 overflights, all limited to the Soviet satellite states because of the aircraft's relatively limited range. I've been able to find details on 4 of these 6. The first, flown by Major Bert Dowdy, took off from Fürstenbruck and went into the region around Bratislava, then part of Czechoslovakia, after a high-level passage across Austria. In this and every mission the Slick Chick undertook, the aircraft flew with transponders off and attempted to accomplish the penetration of Soviet airspace at 0.96 Mach to save fuel. The other mission from Fürstenbruck, also flown by Dowdy, went into the region around Prague. I'm pretty sure that the 2 missions that are unaccounted for also went from Fürstenbruck and were flown by Captain Edgar Hill. The final 2 missions were launched from Bitburg, much further from the border. The first of these was flown by Major Cecil Rigsby and was also in the direction of Prague. It took place on a perfectly clear day, which led to some outstanding photographs being taken. It also led to several very active attempts to intercept the Slick Chick by Soviet MiG-17 interceptors. Rigsby later recalled that the Russian fighters went all out to match his speed and reach his altitude, but they remained at a much lower level. If they had climbed higher, they would have fallen much further behind. One MiG did manage to get into Rigsby's 8 o'clock position, but he was about 20,000 feet below. The American pilot didn't even need to drop his external fuel tanks because he never felt threatened by the Soviet fighters, which broke off as he crossed the border. On his second and final mission into the Warsaw Pact, Rigsby was directed towards Leipzig and Potsdam. Again, he encountered MiGs. This time, however, on the way out, he stumbled across a flight of 4 aircraft that were already near his altitude. Fortunately, Rigsby was in afterburner and heading directly for them. Blowing right past, he continued on, with the MiGs unable to turn and catch him as he escaped back across the border. Shortly after Rigsby's second mission, the U-2 arrived in Europe, ostensibly as a weather observation aircraft. The F-100 didn't fly any further missions into Eastern Europe, but legend has it that there was one more mission for it to perform, which brings us back to northern Turkey in the summer of 1956. Located 600 miles south of Moscow in the Astrakhan Oblast, Kapustin Yar was for a time the center of the Soviet Union's ballistic and cruise missile development programs. Nuclear warhead tests were also conducted in the vicinity. In 1956, the facility was early in the testing program of the R-12 ballistic missile and the Burya supersonic cruise missile. Obtaining photographs of the site was therefore a high priority for the US. It is also, of course, possible that they were keen to get sight of the alien spacecraft that the Soviets were also keeping at Kapustin Yar. In 1953, the Royal Air Force had succeeded in overflying the facility with an English Electric Canberra, but that aircraft had been very nearly caught by MiG-15s, which had succeeded in damaging it. The arrival of the afterburner-equipped MiG-17 meant that more Canberra flights were unwise. So, desperate for information, a Slick Chick flight was authorized. Nothing about this mission has ever been officially released, but I've managed to piece together some scraps of information and I think I broadly understand what happened. Taking off from West Germany on this mission was impossible. Fürstenbruck was nearly 1,400 miles from Kapustin Yar, double the maximum range of the Slick Chick. So Germany was out. Fortunately, the US had started work on a bomber base at Incirlik in Turkey in 1951. This base, then called Adana, initially seems like a good option. Unfortunately, Adana was in the southwest of Turkey, 650 miles from Kabustin Yar. I believe that the mission was therefore staged out of the new airfield at Trabzon on the Black Sea coast of northern Turkey. Flying out from here still meant a 1,200-mile round trip, much of it over Soviet territory. Remember that the safe combat radius for the Slick Chick with 4 drop tanks was just over 700 miles, with only 75 miles of afterburner use. Aside from range, which essentially meant the RF-100A would have to fly a direct route in and out, the other slight snag with the mission profile was the presence of around half a dozen interceptor bases along the route, the little yellow crosses on this map. These bases were largely equipped with a combination of MiG-15 and MiG-17 fighters. But they went ahead anyway, and one day in 1956, the pilot of the Slick Chick tail number 531551 took off from a base in Turkey to photograph Kabustin Yar. The RF-100A was quickly picked up by Soviet radar and, as the target was the extreme range of the aircraft, the pilot had no option but to fly a virtually straight track. As a consequence, the Soviets soon determined the intended target. Throughout the mission, the pilot was faced with the unnerving spectacle of a never-ending stream of Soviet interceptor fighters attempting to bring him down with their cannons. Fortunately, the combination of speed and altitude meant that the Soviet aircraft were firing from disadvantageous positions. Lacking missiles, the interceptors only had very narrow windows in which to take high-deflection shots with their slow-firing cannons and their slow-moving projectiles. Once again, the deficiency of the MiG-15 and MiG-17 weapons package saved a US fighter. The Slick Chick's flight also revealed deficiencies in the ability of Soviet GCI to position their aircraft to intercept a fast, high-flying target at a considerable horizontal offset from their fighter bases. In the process, though, the RF-100A pilot allegedly used his afterburner for 30 minutes straight on the way back out. This resulted in such high temperatures that the titanium fuselage around the engine was burned through. The Slick Chick made it back, but one can only imagine it was on the absolute fumes by that point. A complete new rear end had to be fitted to the aircraft in order to render it flight-worthy again. Whether the pictures were worth the risk is hidden in the secret vaults. A sad footnote to this story is that on September 2nd, 1968, a C-130 Hercules on an intelligence gathering mission strayed over the Soviet border due to a navigation error. It was set upon by MiG-17s almost immediately, which shot it down without challenge over Armenia. 17 US service personnel were killed and many of their bodies have never been returned. The ever-increasing strength of the Soviet air defense network and the need to penetrate deeper into the country to obtain intelligence meant that the Slick Chick's career in Europe was extremely short. RB-57s and U-2s replaced it in theatre. The 2 remaining European RF-100As, one had been lost in a training accident, were boxed up and sent to Taiwan, where they engaged in overflights of mainland China before being retired. I understand that the remaining 5 aircraft were eventually returned to the US and broken up. Few details of their exploits have been released, and as you've seen in this video, few photos of them exist. Maybe one day we'll find out the secrets they uncovered and the danger their pilots endured. I really hope you've enjoyed this one. Researching it has sometimes felt like a significant piece of detective work. If you happen to know anything more about the Slick Chick or related aviation stories, then please hit me up in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.